Today we're going to do a pre-flight on the Robinson R22 helicopter. It's very important to do a pre-flight before each flight to determine the airworthiness of the aircraft. And as pilot in command, you are the one who is in charge of determining that airworthiness. The pre-flight checklist can be found in the pilot's operating handbook and is going to be different for each aircraft. The first thing we're going to check for is to make sure that we have all the documents on board the aircraft that need to be on the aircraft during each flight. We need to have the airworthiness certificate and registration. We also need to have the pilot's operating handbook and the weight and balance specific to each aircraft. In our aircraft, the weight and balance is located inside our pilot's operating handbook. Right now we're going to turn on our master battery switch, and we're going to check our fuel tanks and make sure that we have enough fuel in our main fuel tank and our auxiliary fuel tank. And since our engine's not running, our oil light should be on, indicating that we don't have any oil pressure, and our alternator light should be on, indicating that our alternator is not functioning. After you turn on the master battery switch, the carbon monoxide light will flash twice as it does a self-check on the carbon monoxide system. While our master battery switch is still on, we are going to test our warning light system. The warning light test strip is located behind this cowl door. Right here are all these little buttons, and as we push in on these buttons, the corresponding light for that system should illuminate inside the aircraft. The first button is for our main rotor temp light. The second button is for our main rotor chip light. The third button is for our tail rotor chip light. And the last button is for our low fuel light. This one we have to hold in for a few seconds, and the reason for that is in case we're banking in the aircraft during flight, we don't want the light to come on prematurely, so it kind of has a 3-second delay before the light will illuminate. Next to all these switches are two fuses. One of the fuses for the clutch actuator. The second fuse is a spare fuse for the clutch actuator, and we just need to make sure that these are tight on there and that nothing's loose on them. We're not testing anything with those. After you're done testing your warning lights, you're going to shut off the master battery switch so that you don't run down the battery. The next thing we're going to check is our fuel cap. We want to make sure that it's on tight. The way that we can make sure that it's tight is there's a white line. Part of that white line is on the fuel cap itself. The other part is on the aircraft, and it should line up together. The next thing we want to do is open up this lower cowl door and check underneath our fuel tank and make sure it's not leaking or anything like that. And it's good. The next thing we're going to check is our gearbox oil. Our gearbox oil is located on the side of our main rotor gearbox. We have a sight glass. And we're going to check that sight glass, and it should be at least half full of gearbox oil. The next thing we're going to check is our main rotor brake. Behind our main rotor gearbox there's a little lever, and we're going to lift up on that lever to check the main rotor brake. And we're also going to feel along the cable to make sure that it's not fraying at all. While the cowl door is open, we are going to check a few more things. We're going to check our flex coupling and our yoke flanges. We're going to check that they have no cracks and that the nuts are tight and that the torque stripes are in place. We're also going to check our gearbox teletemp to make sure that it's normal. We're going to check our sprag clutch, that there's no leaks. We're going to check our static source, that it's clear, that there's nothing blocking our static source. We're going to check our control rod ends, that they are free and without excessive looseness. We're going to check our steel tube frame, and we're going to check for any cracks in the paint or metal. We're going to check all of our fasteners to make sure that all of our wires are in place and that none of the fasteners are missing or that there's no loose wires. We're going to check our tail rotor control, that there's no interference with our tail rotor control. The next thing we're going to check is our yoke flanges and our flex coupling. Our yoke flanges are the metal bars, the silver metal bars that are attached to that gold plate, and the gold plate is our flex coupling. We're going to check, make sure there's no cracks, and we're going to check all the nuts to make sure that the torque stripes are all in place. On the main rotor gearbox there's a teletemp. The teletemp shows us what temperature the gearbox has reached. Once the teletemp reaches a certain temperature, it's going to black out the corresponding box. We don't want to have more than 3 boxes blacked out. If there's more than 3 boxes blacked out, we need to have it inspected by a mechanic. On the inside of our upper sheave and what's attached to our driveline is the sprag clutch. We're checking along that seam between the sprag clutch and the upper sheave to make sure that there's no oil coming out. Inside the cowl door is the static source. It's this white tube, and we're checking to make sure that it's clear and that there's nothing blocking it. When we check the control rod ends, we're checking to make sure that it's free without looseness. So this should be able to rotate around this joint but it shouldn't be able to move laterally on that joint. We're also checking the nuts to make sure that the torque stripes are in place. When we're checking the steel tube framing, we're checking all the steel tube framing that we can see inside the cowl door, and we're checking along there for any cracks in the paint or in the metal. When we're checking the fasteners, we're checking all these fasteners that hold on all these wires along the steel tube framing, and we're making sure that they're all tight and that nothing is loose. The last thing that we're going to check is a tail rotor control rod. This is our tail rotor control rod. We're going to move it back and forth to check to make sure that it's free to move and that there's nothing blocking that movement. After we're done here, we can shut the cowl doors and move on to the next section of our pre-flight checklist. When we check the right side of the engine, basically what we're checking for is to make sure that there's no oil leaks, no fuel leaks, make sure that all the torque stripes are in place and that there's nothing that's loose. So the first thing that we're going to check is our carb air ducts. Right here is our carb air duct line that goes down to our carb air duct, make sure that everything is secure. We're going to check our carb heat scoop, which is located right here. We're going to check to make sure that there's no cracks. The next thing that we're going to check is our engine sheet metal, which is all this metal part along the outside of our engine, and we're checking that, make sure that there's no cracks, that all the screws are in place, and that there's nothing missing. The next thing we're going to check is our electrical terminals. So we're checking our spark plugs right here. We also have some electrical terminals in here, making sure that they're all tight. The next thing that we're going to check is our fuel line. Our fuel line is located right inside here. There's an orange line that goes to our carburetor, and we're checking to make sure that there's no fuel leaks. The next thing we're going to check is our oil cooler door, located right here. We're going to open it up, make sure there's no debris. We're then going to check all of our oil lines. We have oil lines right here. We also have some oil lines right here, and just checking for any oil leaks. The next thing we're going to check is our exhaust system. Our exhaust system is right here, and again we're checking for any cracks. Before we finish up, we're going to do one last scan of everything. And now we can move on to the next section of our pre-flight checklist. Now we're going to check the V-belt condition. We're going to check to make sure there's no cracks in our V-belts. We're going to check the slack of our V-belts to make sure there's no excessive looseness. We're going to check the sprag clutch to make sure that it's not leaking any oil, and the upper bearing, that it's not leaking any oil as well. We're going to check the teletemp on the upper bearing to make sure that it's normal. We're going to check the lower sheave groove wear to make sure that it's wearing normally and is smooth and uniform. Right now we're going to check the condition of our V-belts. The easiest way to check the condition is by opening the back cowl door, rotating the upper sheave to rotate our V-belts, and checking the condition of those V-belts. So we're checking for any cracks or roughness along our V-belts. Then we're going to check the looseness of our V-belts, and we're going to check one against the other, and they should be comparable in how loose they are, and they shouldn't go in too far. After we've done that, we can close the cowl door and move on to the next section. To check the sprag clutch and the upper bearing, we're going to look in here to check to make sure that there's no leaks. Then we can check the upper bearing teletemp to make sure that it's normal and that there's not too many squares blacked out. To check the lower sheave groove wear, we're going to reach down here. We're going to feel the lower sheave to make sure that it's smooth and uniform and that they're not sharp. Now we're going to check the flex coupling, yoke flanges, that there's no cracks and that the nuts are tight. And then we're going to check the steel tube frame to check for any cracks in the paint and in the metal. Back here we have a set of yoke flanges and a flex coupling. We're going to check to make sure that there's no cracks and that the nuts are tight and that the torque stripes are where they need to be. To check the steel tube frame, we're going to look all along the steel tubes for any cracks in the paint or in the metal. On the rear of the engine, we're going to check the cooling fan nut, make sure that the pin is aligned with the paint marks. Then we're going to check the cooling fan and fan scroll, make sure there's no cracks. On the back of the squirrel cage blower is a lower bearing with a teletemp on the lower bearing. We're going to check the lower bearing to make sure that there's no oil leaking out of it, and we're going to check the teletemp to make sure that it's normal and there's not too many white boxes blacked out. Right now we're going to check the tail cone surface, and we're going to check all the attachments as well as we're walking along the tail cone. We can check all the rivets, make sure that none of them are missing or loose. We're going to check for any dents or cracks. We can check our anti-collision light and our tail rotor guard. Right now we're going to check the tail rotor. So while we're back here, we're going to check a couple different things. First, we're going to check the sight glass right here on our tail rotor gearbox to make sure that there's oil in it. and that there's no leaking or anything like that. We're also going to check the control rod ends right here, and we're going to check our bell crank. We're going to move our control rod end in and out to make sure that our bell crank moves freely back and forth. While we're at the back side of the helicopter, we're going to check our tail rotor. We're going to check our blades, make sure that there's no cracks or damage. We're going to check our pitch links, make sure that there's no looseness. And we're going to check our teeter bearing to make sure it teeters and that it doesn't rotate in the center. On this side of the tail boom, we're going to check everything again. We're going to check all of our rivets, make sure that there's no dents on this side. We can also check our anti-collision light, make sure it's tight again. Even though we checked it on the other side, it never hurts to check everything one more time. We're also going to check the antenna, make sure that's secure and tight. After we check the tail cone, we're going to check the attachment bolts. There's 3 of them, and what we're checking for is that there's torque stripes and that the torque stripes are properly aligned. On this side of the helicopter, we're going to check the engine oil. We're going to check that the oil is between 4 and 6 quarts. The next thing that we're going to check is the oil filter, make sure that there's no leaks. The next thing we're going to check is our fuel lines. We have a hard fuel line that runs from our main fuel tank down to our gascolator bulb, and then a soft fuel line that runs from our gascolator bulb to our carburetor. We're going to check our throttle linkage, make sure that it's operable. So we're going to raise up on the collective to watch to make sure that the linkage moves. Then we're going to roll all the way off on the throttle and raise up on the collective, and it shouldn't move until the very end, and it should only move a tiny amount. The next thing that we're going to check is our battery and our relay, make sure that they're secure. We're going to check our alternator belt tension, make sure that it's tight. We're going to check our steel tube frame to make sure that there's no cracks or damage in our steel tube frame. Then we're going to check our engine sheet metal, make sure that there's no cracks, make sure that all of our bolts are in place. Then we're going to check our exhaust system. Again, we're checking for any cracks or damage to our exhaust system. And then we're going to take one final look at everything and make sure that everything looks like it should. While we're on this side of the helicopter, we're going to check our main fuel tank. We're going to make sure that we have fuel, and we want to visually inspect it. Make sure we put our filler cap back on and that it's tight and that our lines match up. We're also going to check to make sure that there's no fuel leaks from our main fuel tank. Now we're going to check our main rotor system. The first thing on our checklist is our blades. The easiest way to check our blades is to push up on the back blade, which will tilt our front blade forward. You never want to pull down on the R22 blade. You always want to push up on the other blade. And then you're going to walk to the front of the blade, and you can see up it. You're going to check the blade for any cracks or damage. The next thing that you're going to check is your pitch change boots. Inside each one of the blades, I have a pitch change boot. And what I'm checking for here is to make sure that there's no oil. The next thing that you're going to check is our main rotor hinge bolts. So I have 3 hinge bolts. I have all 3 of these, and we're going to check for cotter pins. Each one of our hinge bolts should have a cotter pin in it. So I can only see one on this side. I'm going to have to rotate my rotor hub around to see the 2 cotter pins on the other side. The next thing that we're going to check is all of our rod ends. So we're going to be checking all these rod ends right here. Make sure that they're tight and they're not too loose. The next thing that we're going to check is our pitch link jam nut. So right here on the top of our pitch link, we have a jam nut, and we're going to check for the torque stripe, make sure that it's in place and that it's in line. Then we're going to check for our pitch link safety wire, make sure that it's in place. The next thing that we're going to check is all of our fasteners. So under my pitch change boot, each one of them has a fastener, and then right here we have a fastener, and right here we also have another fastener. Make sure that they're in place and that they're tight. The last thing that we're going to check is our swash plate scissor. So right here's our swash plate scissor. We're going to check it, make sure that it's not loose. While we're on the side of the helicopter, we're going to check the fuselage. First, what we're going to check is we're going to check underneath the seat in the baggage compartment. We're going to undo the seat belt. And what we're checking for is any unexpected items underneath our seat. We're going to reattach our seat belt, make sure our seat belt works properly. Then we're going to shut the door, make sure it latches. And then we're going to check our door itself, make sure that our cotter pins are in, that everything's good. Then we're going to check our position light, make sure it's attached. If you're going to be flying at night, you want to turn it on and make sure that it works. The last thing that we're going to check is the skids to make sure that our ground handling wheel is removed and that they're okay. When we get to the other side of the helicopter, we would check the same exact things, but on the other side of the helicopter. The next thing that we're going to check is the nose of our helicopter. The first thing on our list is the pitot tube. It's located up on the mast, and we're going to check to make sure that there's no bugs in the pitot tube. The next thing we're going to check is the windshield to make sure that it's clean, that there's no cracks. We're then going to check our fresh air vents, make sure that they're clear. And then the last thing we're going to check is our landing lights. And we're going to turn those on if we're going to be flying at night to make sure that they turn on and they work properly. Before each flight, you want to check your fuel for contaminants. On each helicopter, you're going to have a couple different places that you can check for fuel. On this helicopter, we have one right here. We have one down there. So this one, how it works is we're going to push in, and then fuel is going to come out, and we're going to catch that in our container. Then we're going to look in our container. We're going to check our fuel for any contaminants or water. If you let your helicopter sit overnight, some water might condense inside your tank and settle down. Water is heavier than fuel, so it's going to settle down to the bottom of your container, and it's going to look like little clear white bubbles. Our fuel looks good. The last thing that you're going to do on your pre-flight checklist is when you get inside the cabin, you're going to check to make sure that there's no loose articles and that all your instruments are working properly. Remember that it's very important that you do your own pre-flight, because you are the pilot in command of the aircraft and ultimately responsible for the safety of that aircraft and the safety of that flight.